The Nexus Prime Military Academy had been the crown jewel of galactic warfare education for over 3 millennia, which was roughly 2 millennia and 900 years longer than anyone had bothered to ask whether that was actually a good thing. Perched on the crystal moon of Arcturus 7, the Academy's gleaming spires reached toward the void with the sort of architectural arrogance that screamed, "We definitely know what we're doing here," while simultaneously whispering, "Please don't look too closely at our graduation mortality rates." For the past 50 years, the Academy had maintained what its board of directors euphemistically called species diversity initiatives. This was academic speak for, "We reluctantly allow a handful of primitives from backwater worlds to attend so we can point to them during our equality presentations." The current batch of diversity included 2 Zephyrian gas breathers who communicated through coordinated flatulence, 1 photosynthetic Verdanian who spent most lectures standing by windows like a houseplant, and, most amusing to the faculty, 2 humans from Earth. Cadet Zara had been at the Academy for 18 months, which was approximately 17 months and 3 weeks longer than most betting pools had given her. Standing at 5'6", with unremarkable brown hair, and the sort of stubborn jaw that suggested her ancestors had probably argued with glaciers, she possessed the rare ability to make advanced quantum warfare theory sound like she was ordering coffee. Her survival thus far was attributed by most observers to sheer dumb luck, though a few of the more perceptive instructors suspected it might be something considerably more dangerous. Her partner in academic endurance was Cadet Kex Thornfield, a lanky redhead from Earth's Australian continent who treated the galaxy's most prestigious military institution like an extended camping trip with better food. Kex had the unsettling habit of finding humor in situations that had driven previous cadets to nervous breakdowns, psychological evaluation, or creative forms of suicide involving airlocks. Together, they formed what the Academy's psychological evaluation team had termed a statistically improbable survival partnership. The other species at the Academy treated humans with the sort of benevolent condescension typically reserved for clever pets or particularly advanced houseplants. The Velkans, a species of 7-foot-tall reptilian warriors who considered casual murder a form of interpretive dance, were especially fond of explaining basic concepts to the humans in slow, careful syllables. The fact that both humans consistently scored in the top 10% of their classes was dismissed as either clerical error or evidence of widespread academic fraud. Commander Thex Zaroth, the Academy's chief military instructor, and a Velkan who had personally depopulated 6 star systems during the Sigma Wars, had developed what he considered a sophisticated educational philosophy regarding humans. "They are like children," he would explain to his colleagues while sharpening his ceremonial disemboweling claws. "Dangerous children who must be taught their place through carefully applied pressure." This philosophy had resulted in a remarkable string of training accidents that had befallen previous human cadets, though somehow Voss and Thornfield had managed to avoid becoming statistics. The morning of what would later be remembered as the Thornfield incident began with the sort of bureaucratic normalcy that made mass murder seem like a reasonable career pivot. The advanced combat simulation chambers had been booked for what the schedule listed as Species Integration Tactical Assessment, which everyone understood to mean, "Let's see how quickly we can get the humans to quit or die trying." The simulation parameters had been carefully calibrated by Commander Zarath himself, who had spent considerable time ensuring that the exercise would be educational in all the ways that mattered to his particular worldview. Zara had noticed the unusual number of senior faculty members gathering in the observation deck overlooking Combat Simulation Chamber 7. She had also noticed the way conversations stopped when she and Kex approached, resuming only after they passed, with the sort of forced casualness that suggested everyone had suddenly become very interested in discussing weather patterns on agricultural worlds. "Bit of a crowd today," Kex observed, adjusting his combat harness with the same casual attention he might give to tucking in his shirt. "Yeah, well, we're always such a hit with the faculty," Zara replied, checking her sidearm's charge level. The weapon was standard Academy issue, designed by committee and possessing all the stopping power of harsh language delivered through a megaphone. "I'm sure they're just here to observe our continued academic excellence." The simulation parameters appeared straightforward enough, a standard urban warfare scenario involving the liberation of civilian hostages from a fortified position. the kind of exercise that third-year cadets could complete in their sleep, assuming they had been trained by competent instructors who weren't actively trying to kill them. As all happened like that, the twist, as Commander Zaroth explained with the sort of smile that made small children hide behind their parents, was that they would be facing live opponents rather than holographic projections. For enhanced realism, he announced, his voice carrying the subtle harmonics that Vulcans used when they were particularly pleased with themselves. You will be engaging with volunteer advanced students who have graciously agreed to play the role of enemy combatants. The volunteers turned out to be 6 senior cadets from the Vulcan Combat Specialization Program, each standing 7 feet tall and equipped with the sort of predatory confidence that came from millennia of genetic engineering focused on efficient killing. They wore full combat armor and carried live ammunition, because apparently nothing said educational exercise like the very real possibility of catastrophic injury. Zara and Kex exchanged a look that conveyed several paragraphs worth of profanity and tactical assessment. They had been expecting something like this ever since their performance in the previous semester's strategic warfare course had resulted in what their instructor had termed statistically impossible outcomes, achieved through methods that violate several fundamental principles of military science. Right then, Keck said, checking his equipment one final time. Standard hostage rescue, 6 heavily armed opponents, live ammunition, and an audience of faculty members who are definitely not here to grade our technique on proper room-clearing procedures. Just another Tuesday at the galaxy's finest institution of higher learning, Zara agreed. Try not to die in any way that reflects poorly on Earth's educational system. The simulation chamber reconfigured itself into a 3-story urban environment, complete with civilians, holographic ones, thankfully, scattered throughout a maze of apartments, offices, and narrow corridors. The mission parameters were displayed on their tactical displays. Rescue the hostages, neutralize the threat, complete the exercise with minimal collateral damage, standard stuff really, except for the part where their opponents had been specifically chosen for their expertise in making smaller species disappear. They split up according to basic tactical doctrine, Kex taking the lower floors while Zara worked her way up from the top. It was a sound strategy that had served them well in previous exercises, and there was no particular reason to think it wouldn't work this time, assuming one ignored the rather significant fact that their instructors had finally grown tired of their continued survival. Zara made it through the first 2 floors without incident, which should have been her first warning that something was catastrophically wrong. Combat simulations at the Academy were not known for their generous approach to student welfare, and the absence of immediate life-threatening situations suggested that someone was saving the worst for last. She was methodically clearing the 3rd floor when the shooting started from below. The sound of live weapons fire echoed through the simulation chamber, with the sort of enthusiasm that indicated someone was taking their role as enemy combatant very seriously indeed. Zara's tactical display showed Kex's biometric readings spiking into the red zone before going dead entirely, which was either an equipment malfunction or a very permanent solution to the problem of human overachievement. She made it to the stairwell just in time to hear Kex's voice echoing up from the floor below, raised in what might have been either a battle cry or creative profanity. The words were cut off abruptly by the distinctive sound of Vulcan's ceremonial weapons being discharged at close range, followed by the sort of silence that typically indicated someone had transitioned from actively participating in the exercise to requiring immediate medical attention or possibly a mob. Zara descended the stairs with the careful precision of someone who had suddenly realized that her academic career might be about to take a decidedly terminal turn. The 2nd floor had been reconfigured into a maze of office cubicles and narrow hallways, the sort of environment that favored ambush tactics over fair play. She found Kex in what had been designated as the central hostage area, though the hostages themselves seemed to have been forgotten in favor of more pressing concerns. He was lying face down in a spreading pool of blood that suggested his cardiovascular system had experienced a catastrophic failure of containment. The 6 Vulcan cadets stood around his body with the satisfied air of predators who had successfully concluded a hunt, their weapons still smoking from recent discharge. They seemed to be taking turns explaining to each other how the exercise had concluded exactly as planned, with minimal fuss and maximum educational value for all concerned. "Ah, the female arrives," announced the lead Vulcan, a specimen who went by the name of Vex and possessed the sort of casual arrogance that came from 3 years of watching smaller species learn important lessons about their place in the galactic hierarchy. Your partner proved less durable than we had hoped. Perhaps you will provide better sport. Zara stared at Kex's motionless form, her tactical display confirming what her eyes had already processed. No vital signs, massive trauma to the torso and head, blood loss consistent with major organ failure. The sort of damage that Academy medical facilities were not equipped to reverse, assuming they were even inclined to try. 18 months of partnership, friendship and shared survival reduced to a training accident that would be filed away under acceptable losses in the pursuit of educational excellence. The Velkans had formed a rough semicircle around her, blocking the obvious exit routes while leaving themselves room to maneuver. Professional positioning that demonstrated considerable experience in this sort of work, though they seemed to be taking their time about getting to the actual killing. Probably savoring the moment, or possibly waiting for her to break down in tears and provide them with some entertainment before the finale. The humans were never meant to be here, Vex continued, his voice carrying the sort of reasonable tone that people used when explaining why genocide was actually quite sensible when you thought about it properly. This academy trains warriors, not pets. Your species lacks the necessary qualities for true military service. Zara's hands had stopped shaking, which was odd because she had been quite certain they had been shaking a moment before. In fact, her entire body seemed to have settled into a strange sort of calm that felt like being wrapped in cotton wool soaked in liquid nitrogen. The tactical part of her mind noted that this was probably shock, while a different part, one that sounded remarkably like her grandfather's voice, observed that shock could be quite useful, if properly channeled. Necessary qualities, she repeated, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Right, like the ability to ambush unarmed opponents during training exercises. Survival of the fittest, another Velkan chimed in helpfully. Basic evolutionary principle. Your species simply hasn't evolved the proper instincts for warfare. It was at this point that Zara experienced what psychologists would later describe as an acute stress reaction with dissociative features, though that clinical terminology failed to capture the essential poetry of what happened when several million years of human evolution decided it had heard quite enough academic commentary for one day. The cotton wool sensation vanished, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like someone had replaced her nervous system with fiber optic cables. Her grandfather had served in Earth's corporate wars, back when humanity was still figuring out whether it preferred to kill each other with conventional weapons or creative applications of biotechnology. He had told her stories about what happened to soldiers when the stress got bad enough, how the human mind had evolved certain fail-safes for situations where rational thought became a liability rather than an asset. Berserk, he had called it, though he had used the old Norwegian word that carried implications of bears and uncontrolled fury. When the thinking part shuts down and something else takes over, something older. The something older was apparently quite experienced at tactical assessment, because it immediately noted that the Velkans had made several critical errors in their positioning. They had assumed that their numerical advantage and superior equipment would make the actual fighting a formality, which meant they had prioritized intimidation over security. 3 of them had their weapons lowered, 2 were standing within lunging distance, and their leader was engaged in the sort of villainous monologue that suggested he had learned his tactical philosophy from badly written entertainment programs. Zara's sidearm was in her hand without any conscious memory of drawing it. The first Velkan died while still explaining the evolutionary advantages of reptilian combat instincts, his lecture cut short by the sudden appearance of a smoking hole where his secondary heart used to be. Academy-issue weapons might have been designed by committee, but at point-blank range even bureaucratic incompetence could achieve lethal results. The remaining 5 Velkans reacted with the sort of professional efficiency that came from extensive training, which was unfortunate for them, because extensive training assumed opponents who followed predictable patterns. Humans experiencing acute stress reactions were many things, but predictable was not among them. Zara moved like someone who had suddenly remembered that her species had spent the last few million years perfecting the art of killing things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed. The second Velkan discovered that human reflexes, when properly motivated, could be remarkably impressive. His weapon was halfway to firing position when Zara's boot connected with his knee joint, producing the sort of wet cracking sound that indicated important structural components had stopped being structural. The third Velkan managed to actually discharge his weapon, which was progress of a sort. Unfortunately for him, firing while falling backward after being headbutted by someone experiencing a complete psychological break tended to adversely affect accuracy. The blast scorched the ceiling while Zara's combat knife found the gap between his armor plates, with the sort of precision that would have impressed her instructors if they had been interested in educational outcomes rather than species elimination. The fourth and fifth Velkans had time to realize that their tactical situation had deteriorated significantly. They also had time to call for backup, raise their weapons to proper firing positions, and begin the process of explaining to their families why they wouldn't be returning home for dinner. What they didn't have time for was the actual shooting, because Zara had apparently decided that traditional ranged combat was insufficient for expressing her current emotional state. The Academy's combat training included extensive instruction in hand-to-hand fighting, on the theory that modern warriors should understand the fundamentals even in an age of energy weapons and orbital bombardment. What it did not include was any preparation for dealing with opponents who had temporarily evolved beyond such civilized concepts as proportional response and acceptable casualties. Velkan number 4 learned that human fingernails, when applied with sufficient enthusiasm, could inflict considerable damage to reptilian optical organs. Velkan number 5 discovered that the human jaw possessed significantly more crushing force than standard xenobiological references suggested, particularly when applied to areas that had not been designed with such applications in mind. Praith Vex, the mission leader and senior representative of Velkan military excellence, found himself in the awkward position of being the last survivor of what had been intended as a routine training accident. His tactical assessment of the situation was necessarily brief, given that Zara had acquired one of the fallen Velkan's ceremonial weapons and was advancing on him with a sort of purposeful stride that suggested she had definite plans for his immediate future. "Wait," he managed, which was probably the first sensible thing he had said since the exercise began. This was just training. Orders from the ceremonial weapon, designed for close-quarters combat and constructed according to 3,000 years of Velkan military tradition, removed Krath Vex's head from his shoulders with the sort of efficiency that would have made his ancestors proud. The head rolled across the floor with a wet thunking sound, coming to rest against one of the holographic civilians, who flickered and reset according to their programming. Zara stood in the center of the carnage, breathing heavily and covered in enough blood to supply a small medical facility. The cotton wool sensation had returned, though now it felt more like being wrapped in warm blankets after a particularly refreshing swim. The tactical part of her mind noted that she was experiencing what psychologists termed post-incident dissociation, while the grandfather voice observed that she had probably just violated several dozen academy regulations regarding appropriate use of force during training exercises. She became aware that the observation deck had grown remarkably quiet. The assembled faculty members who had gathered to observe what they had expected to be a routine demonstration of human limitations were staring down at the simulation chamber with the sort of expression typically reserved for natural disasters or administrative budget meetings. Commander Zareth, who had designed the exercise with such careful attention to educational outcomes, appeared to be reconsidering some of his fundamental assumptions about human psychology. His jaw hung open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances, revealing rows of teeth that had evolved for efficiently processing meat. Next to him, Academy Director Vorth Kex, a distinguished Altarian whose species was known for their analytical detachment, was frantically taking notes on what appeared to be either tactical observations or possibly his resignation letter. Zara picked up Krath Vex's severed head by what remained of his ceremonial combat crest, the traditional Velkan hairstyle that was supposed to intimidate opponents through its aggressive styling. It felt surprisingly light, though that might have been due to the absence of all the important thinking parts that had previously occupied the skull cavity. The simulation chamber's exit sealed, opened with a soft hiss, responding to her biometric signature and the conclusion of the exercise parameters. Zara walked out of the chamber covered in blood that belonged to 6 different individuals, carrying the head of their leader, and wearing the sort of expression that suggested she was already mentally composing her post-exercise report. The corridor outside the chamber had filled with Academy personnel, ranging from junior instructors to senior administrative officials who had been drawn by reports of unusual acoustic signatures from the simulation area. They formed a rough pathway, pressing themselves against the walls with the sort of instinctive behavior that apex predators in confined spaces. "Exercise complete," Zara announced to the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the sort of professional calm that suggested she had merely finished a particularly challenging mathematics exam. "Mission parameters achieved, hostiles neutralized, requesting medical evaluation for Cadet Thornfield, though I suspect that's more of a formality at this point." She placed Krathvex's head on the nearest desk, which happened to belong to assistant instructor Fex Nert, a young Velkel who had been looking forward to a career in military education. Fex Nert stared at his former classmate's severed head with the sort of horrified fascination typically reserved for traffic accidents or political scandals. "Training accident," Zara continued, beginning the process of removing her blood-soaked equipment. "Very educational. I feel like I learned quite a lot about interspecies cooperation and the importance of proper tactical positioning." The corridor remained silent except for the soft sound of various species attempting to process what they had just witnessed. Several faculty members were taking notes, though whether for academic purposes or legal documentation remained unclear. Others seemed to be engaged in rapid mental calculations regarding their own career longevity and the wisdom of their current posting. Director Vorth Keck stepped forward with a sort of careful deliberation that suggested he was attempting to navigate a conversation that could easily result in either promotion or court-martial, depending on how the next few minutes went. "Cadet Voss," he began, his voice carrying the sort of diplomatic neutrality that came from 40 years of academic administration, "perhaps you could elaborate on the tactical decisions that led to this outcome." Zara considered this request while continuing to strip off her combat gear, each piece landing on the corridor floor with soft wet sounds that punctuated the silence. "Standard urban warfare doctrine," she replied, as if discussing the weather or cafeteria food quality. "When faced with superior numbers and equipment, the tactical manual recommends aggressive close-quarters engagement to negate the enemy's advantages. I followed established protocols." This was technically accurate, though the tactical manual had probably not anticipated those protocols being applied with quite such enthusiasm. Director Kex made additional notes while various faculty members exchanged glances that conveyed several novels' worth of professional concern and personal terror. "The use of excessive force," Commander Zaroth ventured, his voice lacking its usual confident arrogance. "Perhaps we should discuss the appropriate limits of engagement during training exercises." Zara paused in her equipment removal to give him the sort of look that elementary school teachers reserved for students who had just asked whether they would need to know this material for the test. "With respect, Commander, the exercise parameters included live opponents using lethal force against Academy cadets. I responded according to the threat assessment." She gestured toward the simulation chamber, where maintenance crews were already beginning the process of cleaning up what the official reports would undoubtedly describe as training debris. If the Academy wanted a different outcome, perhaps the exercise design could have been adjusted accordingly. The logic was unassailable, which made it considerably more terrifying than any amount of screaming or emotional breakdown would have been. Commander Zaroth found himself in the awkward position of having his own tactical philosophy quoted back to him by someone who had just provided a practical demonstration of its ultimate implications. Over the following weeks, the Thornfield incident became the subject of extensive analysis, official inquiry, and informal speculation throughout the Academy. The official report, filed by Director Kex after several sleepless nights of careful consideration, concluded that Cadet Voss had acted within the parameters of the exercise and in accordance with established tactical doctrine. The report also included several dozen recommendations for revised training protocols, most of which involved avoiding situations where humans might experience what the psychological evaluation team termed adaptive combat response syndrome. The unofficial reports, circulated through the sort of informal networks that exist in any large institution, painted a somewhat different picture. These reports included detailed speculation about human evolutionary psychology, tactical recommendations for future interactions with Earthborn personnel, and a considerable amount of philosophical discussion about the wisdom of including apex predators in educational programs designed to produce civilized military officers. The most significant outcome of the incident was not administrative or academic, but cultural. The casual condescension that had previously characterized interspecies relations at the Academy underwent a rapid and permanent transformation. Human cadets found themselves receiving the sort of respectful attention typically reserved for unexploded ordnance or theoretical physics professors having nervous breakdowns. Faculty members who had previously treated humans as amusing primitives began demonstrating the sort of careful courtesy usually extended to visiting dignitaries from heavily armed star systems. The betting pools that had traditionally focused on human survival rates were quietly discontinued, replaced by speculation about whether the Academy's insurance policies covered acts of evolutionary psychology and similar technical considerations. 6 months after the incident, the Academy welcomed its largest ever incoming class of human cadets. The recruitment materials, which had previously emphasized the educational benefits of exposure to advanced galactic civilization, now included subtle but unmistakable references to species-appropriate training methodologies and culturally sensitive academic environments. The new human cadets found themselves assigned to specially designed training programs that avoided situations involving live opponents, excessive stress, or any scenario that might trigger what the faculty euphemistically referred to as enhanced performance modes. These programs were marketed as advanced pedagogical approaches, though everyone understood they were actually elaborate precautions against having to explain additional training accidents to increasingly nervous insurance investigators. Zara completed her academy training with honors, specializing in tactical psychology and interspecies relations. Her senior thesis, titled Evolutionary Adaptations in High-Stress Combat Scenarios, a Practical Analysis, became required reading for military psychology courses throughout the Galactic academic system. She graduated with the sort of academic credentials that opened doors to elite military positions, advanced diplomatic posts, and lucrative consulting contracts with species seeking to understand human tactical capabilities. Her graduation ceremony was attended by representatives from 17 different species, most of whom had traveled considerable distances to observe the human who had redefined their understanding of primitive backwater worlds and their inhabitants. The ceremony itself was notably brief and featured none of the traditional competitive elements that had historically characterized Academy graduations. The Velkan delegation, led by Supreme War Commander Toth Keks, father of the late Kraf Vex, presented Zara with a ceremonial weapon crafted according to ancient traditions and inscribed with symbols representing respect, fear, and the sort of diplomatic courtesy typically extended to natural disasters. His presentation speech was brief and focused primarily on the educational value of cultural exchange programs and the importance of understanding different approaches to military science. Following graduation, Zara accepted a position with the Galactic Defense Initiative, where she specialized in training programs for mixed-species military units. Her approach to interspecies cooperation was both innovative and highly effective, though it was noted that her training exercises rarely resulted in the sort of casualties that had traditionally characterized advanced military education. Her former classmates, those who had survived their own academy experiences, went on to distinguished careers throughout the galaxy. They formed an informal network of military professionals who shared a unique perspective on human capabilities and the importance of proper tactical assessment when dealing with species from backwater worlds. The Academy itself underwent significant administrative changes following the Thornfield incident. New safety protocols were implemented, training methodologies were revised, and the faculty underwent extensive retraining in cultural sensitivity and species-appropriate educational approaches. The casualty rates for non-traditional species dropped to historically low levels, which was celebrated as evidence of improved pedagogical approaches and definitely not as a consequence of institutional terror. Commander Zaroth retired from active teaching 6 months after the incident, citing health concerns and a desire to spend more time with his family. His replacement, a moderate Altarian with extensive experience in diplomatic education, implemented a curriculum focused on cooperation, mutual understanding, and the careful avoidance of scenarios that might trigger evolutionary throwback responses in primitive species. The Academy's recruitment materials were updated to include tasteful references to its new holistic approach to military education and commitment to species-appropriate learning environments. These materials were distributed widely throughout human space, resulting in a significant increase in applications from Earth-born candidates seeking advanced military training in a culturally sensitive, academic environment. Years later, when military historians analyzed the broader implications of the Thornfield incident, they concluded that it represented a turning point in galactic understanding of human military potential. The incident demonstrated that species from backwater worlds might possess capabilities that were not immediately apparent through standard psychological evaluation, and that traditional approaches to military education might require adjustment when dealing with species that had evolved under different selective pressures. The most lasting legacy of the incident was not tactical or educational but philosophical. The galaxy's military establishment was forced to confront the uncomfortable realization that their assumptions about primitive species and civilized warfare might have been somewhat optimistic. This realization led to significant changes in military doctrine, interspecies relations, and insurance premiums for institutions hosting educational programs involving humans. Zara herself rarely spoke publicly about the events at the Academy, though she occasionally contributed to academic conferences focused on tactical psychology and evolutionary military science. Her presentations were well attended and highly regarded, though they were noted for their emphasis on theoretical concepts rather than practical demonstration. In the end, the Thornfield incident became exactly what Commander Zaroff had originally intended: an educational experience that taught important lessons about survival, evolution, and the proper assessment of potential threats. The lessons learned, however, were considerably different from those originally planned, and the students who benefited most from the education were not the ones who had been expected to survive the curriculum. The galaxy had wanted to test human military potential, and in that sense, the exercise had been a complete success. The results simply hadn't been quite what anyone had expected, which was probably the most human outcome possible.